How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.
Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Thursday, July the 23rd, day 4 of Andy Burnham's premiership. He's heading to Scotland after another 6 a.m. giveaway. It's become quite the fashion, which has just been announced. A 20% cut to business rates for pubs, clubs and live music venues. But does the way it's funded pass the sniff test, or will that end up being the talking point for the third day in a row? My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
He left the south, he travelled north. I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. If troubles around how to make the sums add up are a theme of week one of the new premiership, another is Burnham's much more relaxed approach to off-the-cuff interviews, causing him perhaps some difficulties down the line. We're going to take a look at that in a moment.
But you have to start with the news on this podcast. I really rather like these 6 a.m. announcements. They're good for us, so keep them coming. The headline is that pubs, clubs and live music venues are set to receive a 20% cut to their business rate bills, according to the press release that's just come out, saving the typical pub an estimated £1,100 next year. They also say that in order to support local high streets, they're reviewing reliefs provided to antisocial businesses such as vape shops, and that's the way that this announcement is going to be funded.
Yes, the where's the money from question is now very live for each announcement. And the press release that's just dropped on this underlines that it is fully funded. I noticed further down it does exclude the largest music venues, so there's a bit of a saving there, and it's targeted on local pubs and club scenes, really. There's that clampdown, as you mentioned, proposed on vape shops and online marketplaces. So the detail on that is very light, and a review is promised. Just one dog that's not barking here, Sam, is a proposed tax to fund this 20% relief, which had been discussed on large retailers' warehouses. Burnham himself had mentioned it, actually, in an interview with LBC earlier this month, and it's had a lot of pushback, as you can imagine, from the retail sector. We had a member of the audience at a Sam and Anne live event in London from the sector last night who was making the point that it could damage business and the business rates, according to people in the sector who have been jumping up and down about it, are getting so unpredictable, they say, that it is damaging their model. So that's missing at the moment. But if there's not a big move like this, I have to say I'm just slightly scratching my head as whether you can get enough from vape shops, and that's slightly difficult to define how you get to the online marketplace for taxation purposes and which retailers to get enough money back from this. But maybe you think I'm being too sceptical.
No, not at all. I'm very much of the camp that you can't pay for a tax cut with a consultation. But, you know, that is the route that they've decided to go down. But there is a lot of relief, as you say this morning, that they didn't go down the route of taxing warehouses, which are often a business like M&S will have a warehouse as well as a shop front. So there was a concern that you would be just harming one part of the business to help another bit, and the net benefit wasn't going to be that great. So they haven't done that. And there is also broadly, I think the hospitality sector think that clamping down on non-compliance and those things like those vape shops, around which there is a lot of suspicion in government, is the right way to go. I actually think there's quite a lot of optimism at the review that you mentioned. The tone of the press release is, here's a little bit of help, but we're going to look at this properly in the budget. And there are lots of proposals out there about how you might sort of reshape business rates, which has been a big sore. Because ultimately, Anne, today's announcement in fiscal terms is tiny. It's small beer. Sorry for the intended pun.
Oh, very
it's only
droll.
100 million. And the thing is, that's £100 million, tiny in fiscal terms, on top of all of the help that was already announced by Rachel Reeves in January. So The headline is about pubs, right? And a 20% relief on pubs. But that's 20% relief in 2027 to 2028, because Rachel Reeves had already announced 15% in this financial year, stretching to April, with bills frozen in real terms for 2 further years. So Andy Burnham really, really wanted a headline about pubs, but pubs were the bit that had largely been dealt with. So he'd actually just gave them a tax relief further into the future. So, you know, nobody will turn down a sort of extended tax relief, but he's just sort of re-announced. He wanted the headline that Rachel Reeves had already had, so he gave it to himself by this roundabout route. The hospitality sector would say, look, there are other bits that are crying out with pain who haven't got similar reliefs. They think it's a good start, but like, for instance, hotels, hotel bills are going up 110%, and all that still hasn't been fixed. So, sort of a welcome start, but lots of problems remain. Can the budget fix it? Is again one of the big themes of the week.
And is there any such thing as a free drink? One story we need to keep an eye on, because its repercussions are so serious also for Andy Burnham and for his plans, is the Iran crisis. Donald Trump has ramped up pressure on Tehran in recent days. The Foreign Office overnight announcing it has temporarily withdrawn all remaining UK staff from Iran as the war escalates again to very alarming levels. And the negotiating chief on the Iranian side is saying that the equation of this war is clear. It is all or nothing. And there's also an even more stringent than previously warning that all Brits should get out of Iran, though you would have thought most would have got the point by now. But anyway, there's no specific reason given, but it does suggest, in this tone of urgency, saying, think about the impact and the risk that you are taking yourselves and your families if you stay, does suggest that a new barrage of attacks could be on the cards. Rude awakening, therefore, Ed Miliband as the new Foreign Secretary, still to establish relations with his US counterparts, who are not said to be thrilled at his arrival. They know he was one of the senior key figures expressing doubts about the UK aligning itself in any way with the war when Donald Trump was asking for UK help in the early stages. Playbook noting this morning that Miliband is set to meet Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State for the US, on the edge of the ASEAN conference in Asia, in Manila, in their first personal encounter.
Yeah, I think this is a few days where Foreign Affairs may just intrude in the way that Andy Burnham didn't want it to. I was suggesting to a Whitehall contact yesterday that everyone's going to be sort of crawling to the end of next week, and then the government can properly plan for its big bang autumn when we get the 10-year plan and the budget and his conference speech, and that's when we'll see the full nature of domestic reform. And this person just said, there will be no crawling. We might be going into a crisis in the Middle East shortly, and we look at the Houthis targeting tankers. All of this has a massive domestic impact. So if you remember, oil before the Iran crisis was at the sort of low 70s mark. Yesterday, Brent crude rose to $96 a barrel, with everything that means for inflation over the coming month and interest rates. I think we're going to get some news on Fed interest rates fairly soon, and where they go, the Bank of England inevitably goes. So mortgage holders as well facing tougher times. So that is all something that Andy Burnham cannot escape, even though he wants to be a much more domestically focused Prime Minister than his predecessor.
Something underlying all of this is communications and how the government sounds and looks. Better and more engaging ways of doing that were, of course, one of the big distinctions that Andy Burnham wanted to draw with his predecessor. And that's not just about nicer optics and T-shirts, etc., and good videos. It is really about the public getting a much clearer sense of direction about what the government wants, what matters to the person at the top of it, and getting away perhaps from that idea of a lot of unjoined up or concatenated ideas and not always brilliantly delivered. So I don't know about you, Sam, but I would say on this early period, his arrival in Downing Street earlier this week, the Burnham style has got some pretty good reviews. He does sound like he means it. He sounds quite authentic. I have heard some people, I think it's an attack line for the Conservatives particularly, saying that this is this chummy style and those cute videos could grate. But, you know, it does remind me that this was a critique of Tony Blair's winsome delivery, which was seen as quite modernising in his day in communications. And you wouldn't look back, you know, whatever you think of the Blair years, you wouldn't look back and say, gosh, the communications were terrible. So I think Andy Burnham does have a style, and that's good. Where it is getting, I think, quite interesting and a little bit more dicey is that he does just chat the chat sometimes, doesn't he? He suggested, for instance, he was looking at raising the personal threshold on income tax in an interview with The Times on Sunday, and again in a briefing on Monday. Then Downing Street seemed to shut it down on Tuesday. He said there's no immediate commitment to increase it, but he'd look again in the budget, and made some comment to the effect of, you know, I can go and look at things. I'm going to be open with you if I'm looking at something. But I don't know if that works when you're Prime Minister as opposed to when you're sitting outside the system, because everything you say is taken pretty literally, right?
That's right. I mean, I think we have got to get used to a new style. I think it's one thing to muse about things you might do. I think there's a specific problem when it comes to tax. When you're the First Lord of the Treasury and you're talking about things that have implications in the many, many billions, which is what unfreezing the personal allowance does, because the markets are watching. This mess was sort of raised with Andy Burnham yesterday. And I did think that his answer in a sort of broadcast pool clip wasn't really necessarily the most sure-footed that we could have had. I'm just going to read you what he said. He said, well, it's funny these days that you can't answer a question honestly without then people reading everything else into it. I want to answer questions honestly in this job, as I said before. I think that's all about trust in politics and doing politics differently, and I'm determined to keep working this way. It was raised a lot, the personal allowance, but then I went on to say, we'll have a look at it in the budget alongside everything else. So no commitment, no unfunded promise. It's just perhaps the way politics is these days and the way people report things. But that was an honest answer. There's no commitment. It's just the way people report things, as if he's musing about something, we should know not to put a banner headline on it. I think that's the bit of the mindset where I feel like he's not going to end up winning. He can't calibrate what he says into to sort of prevent headlines being generated when he says something on multi-billion-pound potential spending commitment at a point where people are worried about his fiscal rectitude. But there's just a tone, Anne, there of self-pity. And I think that's the thing that's ringing a bit of an alarm bell. And I say that in the full knowledge that self-pity at the way the media reports him sometimes has been something we saw in Manchester. You know, phone calls to journalists about headlines he didn't like. He rankles sometimes about other people's characterizations of him. And he was able to get away with a lot in Manchester that simply he won't have the latitude to do. So for all of the credit that I give him for changing the communication style, and I think we can, and the public will tolerate something a bit more relaxed, just feeling a bit injured. I think if we see a lot of that is a weak flank here.
It's interesting you take it into that realm where you think that it may be a weakness of oversensitivity that he's shown in his time in Manchester. I have to say, I also thought it was a slightly naivety was what landed with me, and it reminded me of a very famous cartoon after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is a very ragged looking, down and out Karl Marx, just looking at the wreckage of the Soviet dream behind him and going, sorry, it was just like this idea I had. And it's the disjuncture, as you point out, within our own context, it's the disjuncture between the impact that it has in setting hares running, on the markets, on business planning, etc., on family finances, to say, well, I'll just take a look at it and I'll get back to you. My guess is that he does communicate in a more off-the-cuff way than Keir Starmer. That has pluses and minuses. Some of the minuses we're probably focusing on here. Will he rein that in? in, as whether he likes it or not, he is going to see headlines out of what he says, and will he then just conclude that in the end, it's you can fight the media and you can fight their priorities to a certain extent, but it's the water you swim in. There is another example of this actually, which has also, I think, rebounded to a certain extent, and that's comments about reviewing early release schemes before they're introduced on September 2nd from prisons, splashed all over the place. And so there are now questions if this is going ahead, to what extent, how do you stop prisons overflowing, which was one of those big subjects the government came in saying that it was determined to tackle. So yeah, that's the other reason, I think, to defend the rough old trade of the fourth estate. I mean, if you raise expectations or even suggest them, there are consequences, and journalists are really entitled to go and look into them.
Yeah, I'm quite struck how much they're sort of trying to forge that path of getting around journalists. Now, every government I've ever covered has tried this to a certain extent. But I was line biking to the event that we did last night, Anne, and I sort of crashed into virtually Louise Haig's team, and she was walking up and down the steps of the Underground station in Westminster. I was a bit baffled, and then then we saw the videographer, and it's quite clear she is doing one of these digital videos to sort of communicate. I think she was sort of she was filming a section where it looked like she was going to the north of England, and I think a lot of effort is being put into these digivids, not to put the likes of Sky News out of business, but to go round and tell people a story themselves. I'm interested to see whether it works as a technique, but I think a lot of cabinet ministers' time, judging by my social media feed, is going into spending that, vanity photographers following them round and nice cutesy videos being made. I do ever so slightly question the sheer amount of effort that is clearly and time in a cabinet minister's day that might go into these. But I don't know. What do you make of them?
Well, for a start, I was distracted by you on your line bike because I have seen that in action. If anyone remembers Dastardly and Motley in Wacky Races, you get an impression of the Sam Coates cycling star. So Louise Haig and her team, my entire sympathies are with you if you encountered Sam. It's really interesting that, as you say, like this whole digital video push, I think it's been coming on. We've seen David Dinsmore as a head of government communications get into his stride, very much pushing new media, direct communication. As you say, Sam, it's like goes way back into Alistair Campbell, doesn't this idea? We'll get round the awful media, conventional media. We'll make our own content. This now seems, partly it's easier to do. The quality of it has increased, and they want to do that as a way of, I think, introducing this new team. So that would explain why you met that whole the phalanx of Louise Haig and her people there in her new role, very much at the centre of the government and the cabinet office, probably just trying to explain what it is she's doing. Saw it also with Lucy Powell. There's a very fun bit of digital video when she's sort of wearing this very striking sort of green outfit, and she walks through a door and you see her hand on the handle and you think, what's going to happen? Anyway, she then sits down at a desk because she is, after all, the education secretary, so she does sit down at a desk. And that's it, really. So sometimes you think, well, what was all that about? But I think it's very much about, you look at it strategically, pull the camera back, so to speak, reintroducing a government. New people, new faces, can't wait to get going. All a little bit, sometimes a bit vacuous, but I think that's the intention of it, that it's just going to pop up in people's feeds and look fresh and look interesting.
Right, in our last minute, I'm going to take this discussion about Andy Burnham's communication style somewhere really quite dangerous and toxic. There's a lot of discussion in the papers about whether Burnham's everyman brand can survive the transition to Downing Street. We've read it and talked about it. But there's a column in the Times which is so piercing and so gaslighty and so frankly offensive to almost everybody. I wouldn't be surprised if some people turned off this podcast by the end of what I'm about to say. But it's also, I think, in some way genius and brave from Hugo Rifkind, their columnist. He suggests that what explains Andy Burnham's aesthetic, his style, isn't that he's from Manchester. It's that we're all used and programmed to understanding the way that prime ministers from Oxford communicate, who are sort of brasher, their ambition is worn on the sleeve, sort of braggadocio. But Andy Burnham comes from Cambridge, where there is just much more of an aesthetic of sort of false modesty. And he's very clear it's false modesty. He calls it a passive-aggressive tradition of hiding both competition and ambition. And I quote, Hugo, for Cambridge, remember, they fostered nonconformists and gave rise to the Puritans, whereas Oxford bent the knee to Henry VIII and hasn't quite stood up since, giving some historical depth to what is basically a he's from Cambridge, not from Oxford column, which will just irritate the hell out of almost everybody in the United Kingdom. So before everyone reaches for the off switch, I think that Hugo's bigger point, done in his piercing way, is a brilliant one, because what he's actually saying, the real point of the column, is to say, remember Andy Burnham's background, really, his time as a special advisor, his cabinet with more Oxbridge appointees than any in modern times, and don't be confused by what you're presented with. And remember, there is a real journey that's slightly separate to the journey that we're being told about in these digital videos. So beware confusion between what you're being told and what actually happened.
Hang on, wait, there's a difference between appearance and reality in politics. Listen, for full disclosure, you've got one nonconformist graduate from a stealthy, false, modesty-bathed university on this podcast, and one from the competitive, ambitious, power-seeking, brash Oxford. And you have to guess which is which.
Okay, I think we should end this podcast so that our listeners don't have to do it for themselves. What a week, Anne. What an absolutely incredible junction in British politics. But the good news is you've got another week of us, because we are sticking around, because we will make it to the end of July, even if others do not. See you on Monday.
There to serve. Cheers, Sam.
How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.